The moment Lenora Blackwell looked that rich man straight in the eye and told him no, John Whitaker felt the world shift beneath his boots like the earth itself had decided to pay attention. It was the summer of 1878, and the town of Caldwell, Kansas sat at the edge of everything. The last real settlement before the cattle trails pushed south into Indian Territory, a place where fortunes were made and broken between sunup and sundown, where men carried their ambitions strapped to their hips and their regrets buried somewhere deep in the red dust. Caldwell was loud and restless and forever smelling of horses and leather, and the particular brand of desperation that came with being just one bad season away from ruin. It was not, by any stretch, a gentle place. But then, the most beautiful things rarely lived in gentle places. John Whitaker had ridden into Caldwell 3 weeks prior with $40, a good horse named Cedar, and a letter of introduction to a ranch foreman named Dale Hutchins who had promised him a job on the drives. He was 28 years old, broad-shouldered and lean in the way that hard work makes a man, with dark eyes that had seen enough of the world to be careful and not quite enough to be cynical. He had grown up in Missouri, spent 4 years pushing cattle through Texas heat, and had come to Caldwell because the work was steady and the pay was honest, and that was all he had ever really asked of a place. He had noticed Lenora Blackwell on his second day in town. It would have been impossible not to notice her. She ran the post office and general supply store on the corner of Main Street and 2nd Avenue, a narrow, 2-story building with sun-bleached letters above the door that read BLACKWELL Supply, a name that had belonged to her father before the fever took him 2 years past. She was 25, dark-haired and steady-eyed, with a kind of quiet competence that announced itself without any need for words. She moved through her store like she had built every shelf herself, which, as John would later learn, she largely had. She kept accounts in a leather-bound ledger that she had never let fall behind by so much as a single entry. She knew every family in Caldwell by name, every ranch hand by face, and she extended credit to the ones who needed it and trusted them to make it right when the season turned, which they almost always did, because Lenora Blackwell had a way of inspiring people to be better than they thought they were. John had come in that second morning for rope and salt and a new pair of work gloves, and she had served him with the brisk efficiency of someone who had a great deal to do and intended to do all of it. She had not flirted and she had not simpered and she had not done any of the things that some women did when a new man rode into a frontier town. She had simply helped him find what he needed, told him the total, taken his money and said, "Welcome to Caldwell. The coffee at the hotel is terrible and the coffee at me's diner is something worth riding 50 miles for." He had laughed, surprised by it, and she had allowed herself a small, private smile, and that had been that. He had come back to the store 4 more times in the following 2 weeks, for various things he found himself suddenly needing, and each time she had been the same direct and warm and utterly self-possessed, and he had liked her more with every visit. But he was a ranch hand with $40 to his name and a rented room above a saloon, and she was a woman who owned her own business and kept her own ledger. And so he had kept his admiration to the quiet and orderly space inside his own chest and had not done anything foolish with it. And then came the morning of the 3rd week, the morning that changed everything. He was sitting on the bench outside me's diner, working through a cup of the genuinely excellent coffee and watching the street come to life, the way he liked to do in the early hours before the heat built to something serious, when the coach from Wichita rolled in. It was a fine coach, the kind that was polished and sprung rather than just functional, and the man who stepped out of it was the kind of man who matched the coach. His name, as John would learn from the conversations that erupted around him in the next 10 minutes, was Garrett Ashford, and he owned the largest cattle brokerage operation in the state of Kansas. He was 43 years old, well-dressed in a way that spoke of tailored suits and Eastern money, with a thick gold watch chain that caught the morning light and hair greased back with something that smelled like it cost more than a week's wages. He was not an ugly man, but he had the look of someone who had never once in his life been told he could not have what he wanted, and that look had settled into his face so completely that it had become the primary thing you noticed about him. Garrett Ashford walked directly to Blackwell's supply. John watched him go. He watched the door open and close. And then, because he was a man who understood that none of this was his business, and that he had no claim whatsoever on the workings of Lenora Blackwell's life, he looked back down at his coffee and told himself to stay exactly where he was. He stayed where he was for approximately 4 minutes, which was roughly how long it took for his coffee to go cold, and for the sound of voices inside the store to carry through the open front window in a way that was impossible to ignore. Garrett Ashford had a large voice. The kind of voice that had been trained over decades to fill rooms and command attention. And what his voice was currently saying, carrying easily through that open window and across the morning street, was something along the lines of how he had come specifically to Caldwell to see her, how he had heard about her and her little establishment, how a woman of her obvious quality and capability was wasting herself in a place like this, and how he had a proposition for her that he thought she would find very difficult to refuse. His tone was not cruel. It was something worse than cruel. It was the tone of a man who genuinely believed he was doing her a favor. John set down his coffee cup very carefully. Then Lenora's voice came through that window, clear and composed and carrying the kind of absolute certainty that most people spent their entire lives chasing. "Mr. Ashford, I appreciate you making the trip, but my answer is no." There was a pause. John could almost hear the man blinking. "You haven't heard my full offer," Garrett Ashford said. "I have heard enough," Lenora said. "You want a wife who runs a tidy store in a respectable building, and you want that wife to be grateful for the elevation." "I am already respectable, Mr. Ashford. I already have a building, and I am not interested in gratitude as the foundation of a marriage." Another pause. "My holdings alone are worth—" "I know what your holdings are worth," she said, and there was not a thread of apology in her voice. "And I know what mine are worth. They are different kinds of worth, and mine suits me better. Good morning." John was already on his feet without fully deciding to stand up. He watched Garrett Ashford emerge from Blackwell Supply approximately 30 seconds later, and the expression on the man's face was something John had never seen on a man of that station before. Not anger, exactly, but a kind of genuine bewilderment, the look of someone who has dropped something and cannot understand why gravity behaved differently this one time. Ashford stood on the boardwalk for a moment, resettled his hat, and then walked back to his coach with the particular stiff dignity of a man who intends to pretend this did not happen. The coach left Caldwell before noon. John stood in the street with the sun beginning to warm the dust around his boots, and he turned toward Blackwell Supply, and he thought about what he had just heard with the concentrated attention of a man taking careful inventory of something precious. She had not hesitated. She had not calculated. She had not looked at that man's money and decided what it might be worth to her. She had simply known what she wanted and what she did not want, and she had said so without a single flicker of regret, and the doing of it had been as natural and unhurried as breathing. He understood in that moment, with the clarity that comes sometimes in ordinary daylight and ordinary streets, that Lenora Blackwell was worth more than he had. More than $40 and a good horse and honest work. More than the life he had been living, which was a decent life, but a life built entirely for one. A life that had not yet made room for anyone else, because he had not yet met anyone who made him want to do the building. He felt the weight of that understanding like a hand on his shoulder, steady and serious, and he did the only thing that seemed reasonable. He went and got another cup of coffee, because jumping to conclusions was a quick way to make a fool of yourself, and he had not come all this way to be a fool. The days that followed had a particular quality to them, a kind of charged patience, like the sky before a storm rolls in from the west. John went about his work at the Hutchins Ranch with the same steadiness he brought to everything, but his mind was moving differently, turning over the question of Lenora Blackwell the way you turn a good stone over in your hand to see what the underside looks like. He had no practice with this. He was not, by nature, a man who declared himself easily. He had grown up watching his father love his mother with the kind of quiet, daily devotion that showed up in small actions rather than large speeches. And that was the only model he had for how love was supposed to work, and it did not come with a map for how you got from here to there. So he did what he knew how to do. He kept coming back to the store. He found legitimate reasons, and when those ran thin, he invented polite ones. And when those ran thin, he simply admitted to himself that he came because an hour in Lenora Blackwell's company was the best part of any day that contained it, and there was no use being dishonest about that. He learned things about her, the way you learn things about someone over many small conversations. He learned that she had come to Caldwell from western Missouri when she was 14, with her father and her younger brother, Thomas, who was now 19 and apprenticed to the blacksmith on the far end of town. He learned that her father, Eli Blackwell, had built the store from almost nothing, and that she had learned the business by working beside him from the time she could reach the counter. He learned that she loved the open plains and hated the dust in equal measure, and that she read everything she could get her hands on, and that she had very firm opinions about the proper way to stack flour sacks, and that she could identify a man's character within 5 minutes of meeting him with an accuracy that was frankly unsettling. "How do you do that?" he asked her one afternoon when she had said something precise and correct about a new ranch hand who had just left the store and who had, as she had predicted, turned out to be entirely unreliable. Size people up that fast. She was restacking a row of tins without looking at him. "I pay attention," she said. "Most people will tell you exactly who they are if you are willing to listen. The trouble is most people are so busy talking that they cannot hear." He thought about that for a long time after he left. He also thought about the fact that she had turned down Garrett Ashford without hesitation, but had never seemed to close herself off from the possibility of something else. She was not bitter or guarded. She was simply clear. She knew the difference between what glittered and what was good, and she was not confused about which one she wanted. And John Whitaker, who had no glitter to offer whatsoever, found this to be the most encouraging thing he had learned in years. The event that moved things from the quiet and patient into the open and urgent came on a Tuesday in late August, with the heat still hammering the plains and the cattle drives coming to their dusty close for the season. John had ridden in from the ranch after a long day's work and stopped at the store to pick up a tin of tobacco for Dale Hutchins, which was a legitimate errand, and was making his way through the door when he nearly walked headlong into Thomas Blackwell coming out of it at speed, with an expression on his face that was halfway between scared and angry, and entirely focused on something happening behind him. "Thomas," John said, catching the younger man by the shoulders before they both went off the porch. "What's the matter?" Thomas was 19 and built like the work he did, with his sister's dark eyes and considerably less of her composure. "Fella inside," he said, lowering his voice. "Came in an hour ago, drunk before noon, been trying to get Lenora to extend credit she has already told him twice she cannot extend because he has not paid last month's. He will not leave, and he's getting loud." John did not think about it. He stepped through the door. The man was a cattle hand named Burl Cates, and he was one of those men who became enormous with drink, occupying more space than his physical size accounted for, filling the air of the store with heat and grievance, and the particular belligerence of someone who has decided that the world owes him something, and has identified a specific person to collect from. He was standing at Lenora's counter with both hands flat on the wood, leaning forward, and Lenora was standing her ground behind it, the way John had seen her stand every other ground, straight and still and not an inch of retreat in her, but her knuckles on the counter's edge were white. "I need those supplies," Burl Cates was saying, with the slow, deliberate enunciation of a man who thinks speaking carefully will make him sound sober. "And you are going to give them to me." "What I am going to do," Lenora said with remarkable evenness, "is ask you to leave this store. The credit question has been answered twice today. The answer remains the same. You think you can just—" John said, "Burl." Burl Cates turned. John Whitaker was not a man who raised his voice very often, but he had a way of occupying a doorway that communicated a great many things without any need for volume. He looked at Burl Cates for a long, quiet moment. "I think," John said, "that you should step outside and let the heat sober you up some. Come back tomorrow when you are yourself and have the money you owe, and everything will be fine." There was a long moment where it could have gone several ways. Then Burl Cates straightened up, recalibrated his dignity, and walked out of the store without another word. The bell above the door chimed as it swung closed behind him. The store was quiet. John looked at Lenora. She looked back at him. There was a color in her face that might have been the residue of anger or might have been something else entirely. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was steady, but there was something under it. "Did he hurt you?" John asked. "No." She uncurled her hands from the counter's edge and smoothed her apron with the practical gesture of someone filing an experience away. "He frightened me some. I would not have said so in front of him." "I know that." She looked at him for a moment with those direct, serious eyes. "How did you know to come in?" "I ran into Thomas on the porch." She nodded, and then something passed across her face that was softer than her usual expression, a brief letting down of some careful arrangement she kept herself in. "I would have managed," she said. "I don't doubt it," he said, and he meant it absolutely. "But you shouldn't have to manage everything alone." The way she looked at him then was different from any way she had looked at him before. It was the look of someone who has just heard a thing they have needed to hear for a very long time and were not entirely sure anyone was going to say. "No," she said quietly. "I suppose not." He bought the tobacco for Dale Hutchins and said good night and walked back out into the late August heat. And he was halfway down the street before he fully realized that his heart was beating considerably faster than any of that should have caused. It was Thomas who pushed things forward, because Thomas Blackwell was 19 years old and had his sister's eyes, and about a quarter of her patience with things that were taking longer than they needed to. He found John at the blacksmith shop 2 days later, under the pretense of asking him something about horses, and then he leaned on the fence and said, without any preamble, "Are you going to say something to my sister, or are you planning to buy tobacco for every man in Caldwell County until old age takes you?" John looked at him. "She notices you," Thomas said, with the particular authority of a younger brother who has watched his sister carefully for 19 years. "I notice that she notices. The whole town probably notices. Lenora is just too proud to make it easier for you than it already is." John said, "What does that mean, she notices me?" Thomas sighed the sigh of a young man who feels he is dealing with willful blindness. "It means that when you come into the store she moves differently. Like she is more, I don't know how to say it, more present in the room. She starts conversations. Lenora does not start conversations. She answers them and they are good conversations, but she does not start them. She starts them with you." John was quiet for a moment, turning this over. "She turned down Garrett Ashford," he said. "Yes," without blinking. "I am a ranch hand." "Yes." "And Lenora would tell you, I think, that a ranch hand who comes back because he wants to be in her company is worth more than a cattle broker who comes because he has decided she is an appropriate acquisition." Thomas paused. "But you should say something to her. Do not wait so long that she thinks you are not interested. Lenora is patient, but she is not a woman who will wait forever for something to be said. She will simply move on and you will have missed it." John looked at the plains beyond the town, stretching wide and golden in the afternoon light. "I need to have something more to offer," he said, mostly to himself. "You need to have something honest to offer," Thomas said. "That is not the same thing." He thought about that for 3 more days, which brought him to the 1st of September, which is when he went to talk to Dale Hutchins. Dale Hutchins was a weathered, laconic man of 52 who had been running cattle in Kansas since before the trails were properly named, and who had the habit of listening to everything you said before he responded to any of it, a habit that John had come to appreciate deeply. He sat on the porch of the ranch house with his coffee and listened to John explain, with more directness than he had thought himself capable of, that he had been thinking about his future, and that his future had taken on a specific shape that required him to have more stability than a seasonal hand's wages could provide. Dale drank his coffee. "You have been one of the best men I have put on a drive in 6 years," Dale said, finally. "There is a position here if you want it. Full year, not seasonal. Ranch manager under me. I am not getting younger, and I need someone who can take the operations side in another couple years when my knees give out entirely." He looked at John steadily. "It is not a fortune, but it is steady wages and a foreman's cabin that sits empty on the East Quarter." John said yes before Dale had finished the sentence. He rode back to Caldwell with the afternoon sun at his back, and the specific, nerve-wracking courage of a man who has decided to do the thing he has been working up to and cannot now find any reasonable excuse to delay it further. He tied Cedar to the post outside Blackwell Supply, checked his hat in the reflection of the window like a man who has suddenly become aware that he owns a hat, and went inside. The store was quiet in the late afternoon, that particular quality of silence that falls over Caldwell when the heat is at its worst, and the town takes a breath. A woman named Clara Hendricks was browsing the fabric at the back, and the moment John walked in, she seemed to read something in the air and found urgent business elsewhere, nodding to Lenora and departing with the quiet efficiency of a woman who understands when she is extraneous. Lenora looked up from her ledger. John stood at the counter. "I have taken a full-time position at the Hutchins Ranch," he said. "Year-round, foreman's cabin, steady wages." She set down her pen with care. "That is good news," she said. "Hutchins is a good man to work for." "He is." John put both hands flat on the counter, a thing he had watched Burl Cates do and that felt in his case entirely different in intention. "Lenora, I would like to take you to supper, at Me's, this evening if you are willing. Not as a neighborly thing, as a clear declaration of intent." The silence lasted long enough that John began to form a careful, dignified plan for how to retreat if necessary. And then Lenora Blackwell, who had turned down Garrett Ashford and his considerable fortune without a flicker of hesitation, smiled. It was not the small, private smile he had seen before. It was a full, open thing that changed every line of her face, and it was directed entirely at him, and it was the most beautiful thing John Whitaker had seen in 28 years of living. "A clear declaration of intent," she said, as if tasting the phrase. "I appreciate directness." She closed her ledger and untied her apron. "What time?" They had supper at Me's, and it lasted 3 hours. They talked the way two people talk who have been waiting for the permission to say everything. He told her about Missouri and the drives, and why he had come to Caldwell. She told him about her father's death and the first year of running the store alone and the terror and fierce satisfaction of making it work. He told her about his family, and she told him about hers, about Thomas, who she worried over and was proud of in equal and complicated measure, about her mother who had died when she was 12, and whose face she sometimes had difficulty remembering, and that difficulty grieved her. He listened to all of it. He did not tell her what to feel about any of it, and he did not try to make it better than it was. He simply took what she told him and held it with care, and she noticed this. She said, walking back from Me's in the blue September dark, "You are a very good listener." "You are very worth listening to," he said. She was quiet for a moment. The street was still around them, the town settling into its evening, the sky overhead enormous and strewn with stars in the way that Kansas skies are, that particular western abundance of sky that makes the whole world feel vast and clean. "Mr. Whitaker," she said. "John," he said. "John." She said his name carefully, like she was settling it into its proper place. "I want to be honest with you. Please," he said. "I have not been interested in any man in this town," she said. "There have been men who were interested in me, and I do not say that with vanity, only with honesty, and I have not been interested back. I was not certain whether it was something about the men or something about me. He waited. I think it was about the men, she said, because I am interested in you, and I want that to be clear between us from the beginning because I am not a woman who prefers to have things be unclear. The night air was warm and still and smelled of dry grass and distance. It is clear, he said, and returned, very completely returned. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she put her hand through his arm in the way that women walked with men in 1878, a simple and proper gesture that nonetheless ran through John Whitaker like a current of warm water, and they walked the rest of the way to her door like that. And when he said good night, she looked at him with those steady dark eyes and said that she would see him soon, and that she looked forward to it. He walked back to his rented room above the saloon with the expression of a man who has just received the best news of his life and has not yet worked out what to do with his face. What followed was September and the beginning of October, and those weeks were among the finest of John Whitaker's life. He came to Caldwell on his off days, and in the evenings when the ranch work was done, and he and Lenora walked and talked and discovered the particular pleasure of discovering each other. They walked the edge of town in the long evening light, when the sun went west and turned the plains into something that looked like it had been painted by someone who did not believe in moderation. They ate at Me's and at the hotel, and once had a picnic on the bank of the creek east of town with bread and cold chicken, and a jar of the lemonade that Lenora made with the lemons that came through on the supply wagon. And he told her she was going to ruin him for all other food, and she laughed and threw a piece of bread at him. He met Thomas properly, and Thomas treated him with the watchful, careful respect of a younger brother who loves his sister and intends to take accurate measure of any man who comes near her. John respected this. He treated Thomas as what he was, a young man still finding his shape in the world, smart and good-hearted and a little rough around the edges, and by the end of the first week, Thomas had decided that John Whitaker was acceptable, which he communicated by showing John his work at the forge and explaining his techniques with great seriousness, which was, as Lenora explained afterward, the highest compliment Thomas knew how to give. "He showed you the bellows work," she said. "Showed me and made me try it," John said. "I was bad at it. He was very kind about that." She laughed, and then she looked at him with a warmth that made the breath go out of him. "He likes you," she said. "He does not like easily. He is a good young man," John said. "You raised him well." The something that moved across her face then was complicated and moved quickly, but he caught it, the particular mix of love and grief and pride that comes from being someone's whole family, from being the person who holds everything together and sometimes wishes, just briefly, for something to hold her. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. She turned her hand over and held his. They stayed like that for a while, the lamp burning low, the night outside quiet, the town of Caldwell going about its evening business beyond the windows, and this small and ordinary thing, 2 hands, a lamp. The sound of the plains wind felt to John Whitaker like the most significant moment of his entire life. There were things that were not simple, because nothing in the frontier West was simple, and love did not exist outside of the world it grew in. The store was in better condition than Lenora let most people know, but it was not without its pressures. The 1870s had been difficult years in Kansas, with the aftermath of the Panic of 1873 still working its slow damage through the economy of the plains. And while the cattle trade brought money to Caldwell, it brought it unevenly and in seasons, and there were months when the ledger balanced more by careful management than by abundance. Lenora had turned down Garrett Ashford's money, but that did not mean money was something she could afford to be romantic about entirely. She was careful and precise and honest, and she did not complain about the difficulty. But John learned to read the slight tightening around her eyes when the supply wagons brought prices that had jumped, and the particular way she moved through inventory in the late evenings when she thought no one could see her working the numbers in her head. He did not offer to solve it. He had learned by now that Lenora Blackwell did not want her problems solved so much as she wanted a partner who understood that she was capable of solving them herself, and who stood beside her while she did. So he stood beside her, and when she was working late on accounts he came and sat in the store and read. She had a small collection of books on the shelf behind the counter, and his presence there, quiet and steady and not asking anything of her, seemed to be more valuable to her than any offer of money would have been. He told her, one evening in October when the first edge of autumn had found its way into the Kansas air, about the foreman's cabin on the Hutchins ranch. "I have been out there to look at it properly," he said. They were walking the edge of town, the sunset wide and orange before them. "It has good bones, 2 rooms now and space to add. There is a well and a kitchen with a proper stove. Needs work, but good work, the kind of work that is worth doing." She looked at him. "You are telling me this because I am telling you this because I am thinking about the future," he said, "and I would like to know what you think of it." She was quiet for several steps, and in that quiet John understood with complete clarity that he had loved her for some time now and that he was not at all afraid of it. "I think," she said carefully, "that a 2-room cabin with space to add and a proper stove sounds like a beginning." He stopped walking. She stopped too and turned to look at him, and there was the color in her face again and the warmth in her eyes that she did not ration for anyone else but gave fully to him. "Lenora," he said, "I am not a wealthy man. I will not pretend to offer you what Garrett Ashford offered." "Good," she said, "because I told you what I thought of that offer. I have steady work and good wages and a solid cabin, and I will be honest with you and work beside you, and I will not ever make you feel like something I acquired." He looked at her directly, the way she always looked at the world, and his voice was steady even though his heart was making itself known in his chest. "I love you. And I hope, that is worth something." She looked at him for a long, serious, beautiful moment. "John Whitaker," she said, "it is worth everything." He kissed her then, there in the October evening with the plains orange around them and the town of Caldwell at their backs and the whole of the West stretching out ahead, and it was the kind of kiss that seals something, that makes permanent what was previously only hoped for. When they separated, she had her hands against his chest and her eyes were bright and she was smiling the full, open smile that she only gave to him. "I love you too," she said, "quite thoroughly. I believe I have for some time." "I know," he said. She laughed. "You know? Your brother told me you moved differently in the store when I came in," he said, and she made a sound of absolute and affectionate indignation and pushed against his chest with both hands, and he caught them and held them and they stood together in the fading light, laughing. They were engaged by November. It was not a dramatic proposal. It was John sitting across from Lenora in the store after closing, with the lamp lit and the evening wind making its small sounds against the window, and saying that he would like to marry her and asking if she would like to marry him, and her saying yes without deliberation, the way she did everything, clearly, honestly, completely. Thomas was told the next morning. He stood in the doorway of the smithy and looked at them with his arms crossed and his brow furrowed in the way he had when he was processing something significant, and then he said, "Well, it took you long enough," and went back to his work, which, Lenora explained to John while trying not to laugh, was absolutely Thomas's version of deep and heartfelt approval. The town received the news with the warmth that small communities have always reserved for good things happening to people they respect. Me, of the diner, made them a pie and brought it to the store personally. Dale Hutchins shook John's hand for a long time without saying much, but his eyes were bright. The women of Caldwell organized around Lenora with the focused energy of people who have been waiting for an occasion to focus their energy upon. There was one discordant note. Word reached Caldwell in mid-November that Garrett Ashford had not taken his rejection as gracefully as his exit had suggested. He had made certain remarks in Wichita about the general quality of certain frontier shopkeepers, remarks that were vague enough to be deniable, but pointed enough to be understood. When this reached Lenora's ears, via Clara Hendricks, who had family in Wichita and correspondence to match, She was quiet for a moment and then said, with the absolute serenity of someone who has already won the argument without knowing there was one. "Good. I hope he is very occupied with his opinions. I am occupied with other things." And she turned back to her ledger, and that was the end of it. John, hearing this second-hand from Thomas, felt a surge of love for her so pure it was almost staggering. He sat with it for a while, this specific wonder at having found a person who moved through the world with that kind of clean, unhurried certainty. He had understood, on that morning outside Me's diner when he heard her turn Ashford down, that she was worth more than he had. What he understood now, with the full weight of knowledge behind it rather than just the quick recognition of it, was that the worth was not measured in the ways the world usually kept score. It was measured in the things she built, and the choices she made, and the people she loved, and the way she stood her ground with her hands steady and her eyes clear. It was measured in all the small, daily, accumulating evidences of a person who knew who she was. And he, John Whitaker, had the extraordinary luck of being the person she had chosen to stand beside. They were married in January of 1879, on a clear cold day when the plains were pale, and the sky was the hard blue of winter, and the sun put a sharp white light on everything. The ceremony was at the small church on 2nd Street, and it was full, because Caldwell was a town that understood the value of a celebration and did not miss one when it came. Lenora wore a dress of deep blue wool that her friend Caroline Hayes had helped her make, and her hair was up in a way that showed the line of her neck. And John, standing at the front of that small church and watching her walk toward him through the light, thought that he had never in his life seen anything so precisely right. They said their vows with a steadiness that matched who they both were, clear and serious and meaning every word. And when it was done, and the small crowd in the pews made the warm sounds of a community that is pleased with the world, John Whitaker took his wife's hand and held it the way you hold something you intend to hold for the rest of your life. The reception was at Me's, which had been cleared of its usual furniture, and filled with people and food and a fiddle player from the edge of town who played with more enthusiasm than precision, but with excellent intent. And the whole evening had the quality of something warm and generous, a room full of people who were happy to be there, and meant it. Thomas danced with every woman in the room who would have him, and some who initially would not. Dale Hutchins stood in a corner with his coffee, and looked at John with the expression of a man who is satisfied with how things have turned out. Clara Hendricks and Caroline Hayes cried, which they had apparently agreed to do as a joint project, and neither of them was embarrassed about it. John and Lenora danced, and though John was no great dancer, he was steady and he paid attention, and Lenora was graceful enough for both of them, and they moved through the lamplight together with their hands joined and her head for a moment against his shoulder, and the fiddle making its earnest music around them. And it was the happiest night of John Whitaker's life. They moved into the foreman's cabin on the Hutchins ranch in late January. Lenora did not close the store. They had discussed it at length, in the careful and honest way they discussed everything, and the conclusion was obvious to both of them. The store was hers, she had built it and maintained it and intended to keep it, and the idea that marriage should require her to hand over what she had made and managed was not a discussion they needed to have twice. She hired a young woman named Alice Tremaine to help with the daily running of it, a sharp-eyed girl of 20 who learned quickly and took pride in her work. And Lenora rode into Caldwell 3 days a week to go over accounts and manage the things that required her specific attention. This arrangement worked with the logic that Lenora brought to everything practically, sensibly, in the service of the life they were actually building rather than the life they were theoretically supposed to build. John rode into town with her on those days and came back to the ranch, and sometimes she stayed into the evening and he came back for her, and the routine of it, the shared mornings and the joined returns, the cabin lit and warm in the winter evenings, had a richness that surprised him even though he had hoped for exactly this. Winter on the Kansas plains had its own severity. The cold came in from the north with a flat, committed authority, and the wind across the open country was the kind of wind that had no obstacles to wear it down before it reached you. The cabin was solid and well chinked, and the stove was good, and in the evenings with the lamp and the fire and the cold pressing itself against the windows, there was an interior warmth that was more than temperature. They read together, he and Lenora, which was a thing John had never done with anyone before, sitting companionably with their books in the firelight, occasionally reading passages to each other, occasionally arguing cheerfully about the contents of what they were reading, occasionally setting the books aside entirely because the company was better than the contents. He began the additions to the cabin in early spring, when the ground thawed enough to work. Lenora was not the kind of person who asked for things without saying why she was asking, and she was not the kind of person who felt entitled to more than what the circumstances provided. But she had mentioned, in passing, the additional room, and she had done so with the particular lightness of tone that John had learned meant something was actually important to her. So he talked to Dale, and Dale gave him timber from a stand the ranch had cut the previous fall, and on his off days through March and April John framed up the addition with the help of Thomas, who had become a constant presence and who threw himself into the construction with the enthusiasm of someone who is very good with his hands and enjoys problems with visible solutions. The three of them spent those weekend days building, and in the evenings Lenora cooked for all of them, and they sat around the table in the original room and talked and laughed and argued about things of no consequence. And John thought, watching Lenora and Thomas together across that table, the comfortable, complicated love of a sister and brother who have been each other's family through difficulty and come out the other side, that he had been given something larger than a wife. He had been given a family, and he had not known how much he needed one until it was there. The spring of 1879 brought the cattle season back with it, and John was deep in the work of the ranch, managing the preparations for the drives with the combination of experience and organizational care that had made Dale Hutchins decide he was worth the full-year position. The work was demanding and satisfying, the kind of work that uses you completely so that at the end of a day you are tired in a clean, uncomplicated way, tired without residue. One warm evening in late April, Lenora sat across from him at the dinner table and looked at him with an expression he had not seen before, not quite her usual directness, something softer and more careful in it. "I have something to tell you," she said. He waited. "We are going to have a child," she said. The silence lasted only a moment because John Whitaker was not a man who needed time to know how he felt about something. He came around the table and took her face in his hands with the utmost gentleness, the way you handle something invaluable, and he looked at her for a long moment with everything he felt moving in his face, and then he said very quietly, "Are you well? Are you feeling well?" She laughed, a small, startled laugh, and her eyes went bright. "I am very well," she said. I wanted to tell you, I wanted to see your face." He kissed her forehead. "I love you," he said. "I love you enormously." "I know," she said, with the gentle echo of the night in October when he had told her he had known she loved him, and they both understood what was happening, the language of two people who have become fluent in each other, who have built their own vocabulary out of shared moments and private references, and the particular, irreplaceable knowledge of being known by someone who chooses to know you. He sat back down but kept her hand across the table, and they talked into the evening about what came next with the same clear-eyed practicality and warmth that they brought to everything, and outside the cabin the spring night spread wide and full of stars over the Kansas plains. Thomas, informed the following Sunday, said, "Well," with great seriousness, and then, after a moment, "I hope it is a boy. Boys are less trouble." Lenora threw a dish towel at him. "I base that on my own experience," Thomas said, from behind the dish towel. "The pregnancy was not without its difficulties. June brought heat and July brought more of it, and Lenora, who had never in John's experience allowed physical discomfort to alter her operational capacity, found the summer hard in ways she was honest about with John and not with anyone else. She kept the store running with Alice's help and came home in the evenings quieter than usual, and John learned the particular shape of this difficulty and met it with the same quiet steadiness he had given everything else. He took over the cooking without announcement, which she noticed but did not argue with. He drove her to town on the days she would otherwise have ridden alone. He learned to tell by the set of her shoulders when a day had been long and did not require conversation, and on those evenings he simply put food in front of her and sat near her and let her be tired without asking her to perform anything. "You are very good at this," she said, one August evening, not quite an accusation and not quite a compliment, something more specific than either. "At what?" he said. "At not needing me to be anything," she said. "At just allowing me to be what I am at any given moment." He thought about it. "You do the same for me," he said. She considered this. "I suppose I do." "Then we are good for each other," he said. She was quiet for a moment, and then she put her head against his shoulder, which she did only rarely, not because she was withholding but because she was precise about her gestures and the ones she gave carried weight. "Yes," she said, "we are good for each other." The child was born in late November of 1879, which Lenora's calendar made 22 days past what they had estimated, and those extra 22 days were instructive to John about the limits of his considerable patience, which he discovered were real, but also were being dramatically expanded by the requirements of loving Lenora Blackwell. The birth was attended by the town doctor, an experienced and steady man named Dr. Farley, and by Caroline Hayes, who had done this before for half the women in Caldwell, and who ran the proceedings with an authority that was deeply reassuring. John spent those hours in the way that men spent them in 1879, which is to say outside, and at a miserable remove from the woman who was doing the most significant thing he had ever been adjacent to. Sitting on the porch of the cabin in the November cold with Dale Hutchins and Thomas, and a pot of coffee, the three of them not saying very much but needing each other's company very badly. Thomas was 20 years old and was not good at waiting. He stood up and sat down approximately 30 times in the course of those hours, and each time John caught his eye and gave him the look that said, "She is fine. She is exactly as capable of this as she is of everything else," and Thomas would nod and sit back down and last approximately 4 minutes before standing again. The cry, when it came, was thin and fierce and certain of itself, and all three of them were on their feet before it finished. Caroline Hayes appeared in the doorway. She was beaming. "A boy," she said. "A healthy boy, and Lenora is fine. She says to tell you she is fine and to stop hovering." John went inside. Lenora was propped against the pillows with the look of someone who has just done something extraordinarily difficult and is aware that they have done it extremely well. Her hair was loose and there were shadows under her eyes, and she was entirely, completely beautiful. In her arms was a very new and very red and remarkably loud person who was expressing himself with the full force of his available lung capacity. John sat on the edge of the bed and looked at them both. "He has your eyes," Lenora said. Her voice was tired but steady. "He has your opinions about things," John said, because the child had not yet stopped communicating them. She laughed, which seemed to be something she had not expected to do right at that moment, and it softened her face into something radiant. "Do you want to hold him?" she said. He took the child the way Lenora had taught him from the beginning, to take things that were precious with both hands, with full attention, without pretending to be casual about it. His son, which was the most extraordinary word he had yet tried on in his life, looked up at him from an impossible distance of newness and went briefly quiet, as if taking inventory. "Well," said John Whitaker to his son. "Hello." They named him Eli after Lenora's father. The naming was Lenora's idea, and John agreed to it immediately, without any need to think about it, because it was exactly right, and he had learned early to recognize when Lenora had landed on the thing that was exactly right, and to simply say so. Eli Whitaker came into a life that was already built and waiting for him, warm and solid. A mother and father who knew who they were and what they had and treated both with care. An uncle who arrived every Sunday with the specific energy of someone who intended to be the child's favorite person. A town that received him as towns receive children, with the communal proprietary warmth of people who understand that all children belong, in some partial way, to the place that holds them. The year that followed was one of growth, and by that John meant the word in all its meanings. Eli grew with the particular, astonishing speed of babies, who are one thing in November and an entirely different thing by February, larger and louder and more distinctly themselves every time you looked. The ranch grew, because 1880 was a good year for the cattle trade, and John's management of the drives brought the Hutchins operation its best season in years. And Dale Hutchins responded by raising John's wages and saying, with his characteristic economy of language, that he could see the day coming when John would want to talk about buying into the ranch proper. Which was the most forward-looking sentence Dale had ever deployed, and which John received with appropriate solemnity and considerable internal excitement. And Blackwell Supply grew because Lenora, restored to herself after Eli's arrival with the speed of someone who had always intended to be restored, brought to the store the same energy she brought to everything. And she had in Alice Tremaine a deputy she trusted and who trusted her back. And between them they began expanding the supply side, bringing in goods that the growing town of Caldwell actually needed rather than just the goods that were easiest to stock, which had the effect of making the store the first stop rather than the last resort for most of the ranching families in the surrounding county. She was good at it in the way that not everyone is good at the thing they do, not just competently, but with a kind of intuitive understanding of what was needed and what was possible that meant her decisions were almost always right. And when they were wrong, she learned from them specifically rather than generally, filing the precise lesson away and not making the same mistake twice. John admired this with an admiration that was no longer surprised by anything she was capable of but was still moved by it, because it was hers, it was Lenora, and he loved her, and so he loved all of her. In the spring of 1881, something happened that brought the past back into the present. A letter arrived at Blackwell Supply addressed to Lenora, with a return mark from Wichita, and Alice brought it to the counter with the careful face of someone who has noticed the return address and does not want to be seen to have noticed. Lenora opened it at the counter while John stood nearby, and he watched her read it with his usual attention to her face, and what her face did was interesting. Nothing at all, which was itself informative. She handed it to him when she was done. It was from Garrett Ashford's business office. A formal letter, precisely worded, informing Miss, the letter said Miss, which Lenora had noticed Lenora Blackwell that Garrett Ashford had recently purchased the land parcel adjacent to the property on which Blackwell Supply stood, and that as the new landowner he was entitled to review certain easements and access arrangements pertaining to the shared alley between the properties, and that his legal representative would be in touch. John read it twice. He still says Miss, Lenora noted. He still does not know your news, apparently, John said. She folded the letter with the precise efficiency she applied to things she was done thinking about. He has bought the adjacent land, she said. That is the Callaway parcel. It has been for sale since old Mr. Callaway died last winter. What does he want with it? John said. I cannot imagine he wants the land, she said. He wants the annoyance. He is the kind of man who does not forget that he was told no and who has the resources to make that memory expensive for the person who told him. This was said without alarm, only with the clear assessment that it was. John looked at her. What do you want to do about it? He said. She thought for a moment. I want to talk to Reverend Caldwell about the property law, and I want to write to a solicitor in Wichita that Clara Hendricks's family has used. And I want you not to ride to Wichita and do anything that would put you in a jail. She looked at him with one raised eyebrow, which was her equivalent of a very emphatic statement. I was not planning. You were planning to be angry about it, which was going to lead naturally to planning to go to Wichita, which was going to lead naturally to a series of decisions that would be very satisfying for about 10 minutes and then deeply inconvenient for much longer. She tucked the letter into her apron pocket. I am also angry about it. And I intend to handle it the way I handle everything. Carefully, he said. Thoroughly, she said. She was right, and she was also very effective at what she proposed to do. The solicitor from Wichita, a compact and precise man named Mr. Hollis, came to Caldwell within 2 weeks of being contacted, and spent an afternoon with Lenora and her ledgers, and the deed to the Blackwell property. And what he determined, with the satisfaction of a man who enjoys finding the answer, was that the alley easement had been established in Caldwell's founding land grants, and was not subject to review by any subsequent adjacent landowner, and that Garrett Ashford's legal position was, to use the precise terminology, extremely thin. He also, on the way out, mentioned to John with what appeared to be casual observation that Mr. Ashford had recently suffered a significant loss on a cattle futures arrangement that had not gone the way he had expected, and that he was perhaps not as formidably resourced as he had once been. John received this information and did nothing with it except tell Lenora, who received it with the expression of someone who is carefully not smiling. I do not wish him ill, she said. Of course not, John said. I simply note, she said, that the world tends to balance its accounts over time. There was no further correspondence from Garrett Ashford's office. The adjacent Callaway parcel sat empty for several years before being purchased by a feed merchant from Nebraska who built a practical building on it, and who became one of Blackwell Supply's best customers. The years moved forward with the particular good momentum of a life that has found its direction. 1881 became 82, and 82 became 83. And through all of it, the Whitakers built and maintained and expanded the life they had begun in that foreman's cabin with its 2 rooms and its good stove. The cabin grew as John had promised it would, a 3rd room added in 1881 and a proper porch in 1882, and Lenora planted things on that porch and around the door that she had been planning since before the addition was finished. Small defiances of the plain's severity that turned into something genuinely abundant by the 2nd summer. Eli grew from a baby into a boy with the speed that children achieve when you are watching them carefully, growing in ways you anticipated and in ways you did not. He was a quiet child, more like John than Lenora in that respect, but with his mother's eyes and his mother's specific quality of paying attention. And from the time he could walk, he followed John around the ranch with the earnest focus of someone who intends to understand how everything works. John taught him what he knew with the patience that his own father had brought to teaching, without condescension, without impatience, with the genuine respect for the child's intelligence that produces, in return, a child who trusts the teacher. Thomas remained a constant presence. He had by now established himself as one of the most skilled smiths in Caldwell County, and the work that came to his forge reflected this. Not just the everyday ironwork of horseshoes and wheel rims, but the more specialized and valued work of mechanisms and fittings, and he had begun to have work come in from as far as Wichita, which delighted him, and which Lenora received with the satisfaction of a sister who has never doubted her brother's potential, but is still tremendously pleased to watch it realized. Thomas, at 23, had also met a young woman named Rebecca Fair, the schoolteacher's daughter, who was 21, and who matched him in energy if not in direction, and who treated his enthusiasms with the combination of genuine appreciation and gentle correction that he very clearly needed. John watched this development with the particular benevolent attention of a man who has recently been happy and wants the same for the people he loves, and when Thomas came to him, one evening in the spring of 1883, with the look of a man who has a question he is not sure how to ask, John set down what he was doing and waited. "How did you know?" Thomas said. With Lenora. How did you know it was? How did you know she was the one? John thought about it for a genuine while. She turned down a man who had everything, he said. Everything that the world says should matter. And she did it without any hesitation, without any regret, and I watched that and I understood that she knew what was worth something. And then the question was whether I was worth something. He paused. And whether I could be worth enough. Thomas was quiet. With Rebecca, John said, the question is not whether she is worth it. I think you already know that. The question is whether you are ready to be the kind of man who deserves her. And the fact that you are asking me that question tells me you are further along than you think. Thomas stared at the fire for a moment. Then he said, "She is remarkable, John." "I know," John said. "Tell her." Thomas married Rebecca Fair in June of 1883, in the same church where John and Lenora had made their vows, and it was a lovely ceremony. And Lenora cried, which she did not do very often, and Thomas got a fine flush across his face when Rebecca walked toward him and tried to pretend it was the sun in his eyes. And Rebecca, being Rebecca, let him have that pretense without even the smallest smile, because she was a woman who understood when to be kind. 1983 also brought John his conversation with Dale Hutchins about buying into the ranch, which had been approaching for 2 years, and arrived with the straightforwardness that marked everything Dale did. He offered John a 30% stake in the operation at a price that was fair by any measure, a price arrived at by the kind of plain dealing that is the most reliable form of respect. John said yes, as he had known he would, and they shook hands on it at the porch of the ranch house in the late afternoon, and Dale said, "Your father would have been proud of you, John," which he had never said anything like before in their years of working together, and which therefore went through John with the force of something that had been waiting to be said. "Thank you, Dale," he said. Dale nodded and went inside, and John stood on the porch for a moment in the autumn light, looking out at the plains, at the horses in the south pasture, and the rise of land beyond them, and the enormous sky above all of it. And he thought about everything that had brought him here. The $40 and the letter of introduction and the good horse and the morning outside Me's diner, when he had heard a woman he did not yet know speak with the voice of someone who could not be bought. He thought about how small the purchase price of that beginning had been and how rich the account had grown. He went back to the cabin, where Lenora was at the table with Eli, going over the reading lessons she did with him on Tuesdays and Thursdays, her finger moving along the line of text, while Eli's face worked through the concentration that reading required of him, his young brow furrowed in the precise and earnest way of a child who has decided this is worth figuring out. The lamp was lit, as it always was in the evenings, and the smell of the dinner she had made was still in the air, and from somewhere outside came the sound of the wind through the new leaves on the cottonwood John had planted beside the porch 3 springs ago. Lenora looked up when he came in. "How did it go?" she said. "We shook hands," he said. Her face did what it always did at good news about something she had invested hope in, a controlled, warm light that she did not quite try to suppress. "Come here," she said. He sat beside her at the table, and Eli looked up from his book with the direct gaze he had inherited from his mother and said, "Papa, what is an encumbrance?" Which was apparently where the reading lesson had arrived. John put his arm around his wife and looked at his son. "An encumbrance," he said seriously, "is anything that makes it harder to move forward than it should be. But the trick is knowing the difference between an encumbrance and something that is worth carrying. Some things that feel heavy are worth every ounce." Eli thought about this with great seriousness. Lenora looked at John with her eyes warm and knowing, the look of a woman who understands exactly what is being said and to whom it is partly addressed. In the fall of 1884, Lenora told him she was expecting again. This time she told him in the evening on the porch, with the October stars beginning to appear above the plains and the last of the heat finally leaving the air, and his response was immediate and certain. He took her hand and held it and said, "Good. which was not the most eloquent response but was the most accurate one, containing within it everything he actually felt, which was a vast and uncomplicated gladness. This pregnancy was easier than the first, or perhaps Lenora was simply more practiced at carrying it and at maintaining her operations regardless. She continued to go into town, continued to see to the store, continued to do the 1,000 things that Lenora Blackwell did in the daily course of existing, and when John worried, which he did, she told him she was well, and he believed her, because she was the most honest person he knew, and she had never yet said she was well when she was not. The child was born in late April of 1885, on a spring evening with the air smelling of the new grass, and the long-absent rain finally back in the country after a dry winter. She was a girl, small and dark-haired, and from her first hour possessed of the kind of focused watchfulness that suggested she was already cataloging information. They named her Clara, after Clara Hendricks, who had been Lenora's first friend in Caldwell, and who had sent so much correspondence so many times on her behalf, and who had sat with her in every difficulty with the steady warmth of a woman who took friendship seriously. Clara Hendricks, of the living and breathing variety, received the news and the honor of the naming with considerable emotion, standing in the store 3 days after the birth and holding baby Clara with the careful arms of a woman who has always wanted children and has made peace with a different kind of life, and saying, with her voice very slightly unsteady, "She is perfectly beautiful, Lenora." "She is," Lenora agreed, from the chair where she was recovering in the gracious and unhurried way her body was apparently doing this second time. "She looks like she is planning something." "Good," said Clara Hendricks, with complete approval. Eli, who was 5½ and had been waiting for the arrival of this sibling with the mixture of anticipation and uncertainty that older children feel, walked over to Clara's basket the first morning and looked at her for a long time with his mother's serious expression. "She is very small," he said. "You are very small," Lenora said. "I do not remember that," Eli said, as if this was a defense. "You will remember her," Lenora said. Eli considered the baby again. Then he said, "She can have my old wooden horse," which was, John understood, a very significant sacrifice, and which meant that Eli had decided something important about his sister. The years between 1885 and 1887 were the fullest years of John Whitaker's life, and he was aware of this while they were happening, which was a gift not everyone was given. He knew, in the way that you know things when you have paid attention long enough, that this was the time he would look back on. The ranch and the work and the cabin expanded now into something genuinely comfortable. The children growing with the daily astonishments of children, Lenora more herself than ever, the deep familiarity between them that had grown richer rather than smaller with time. They had by now the language of 8 years of marriage, the shorthand of 2 people who have become expert in each other, the ability to communicate volumes in a glance or a silence, or the particular way one of them moved when something was worrying them. They had also preserved, with care, the part of themselves that was still surprising to each other. John still occasionally said something that made Lenora stop and look at him with fresh attention, and she still did things that reminded him he had not yet fully mapped the territory of her, and this seemed to him the most hopeful thing about long love, that it did not flatten into simple familiarity but deepened into something that contained both comfort and discovery. Dale Hutchins's knees did finally give their notice in the spring of 1886, not dramatically but gradually and then completely, and the conversation they had about John taking over full operations of the ranch was a simple and satisfying one, the kind of transition that looks inevitable in retrospect, because it was built on so much preceding preparation. John became the primary operational manager of the Hutchins ranch, with Dale retaining his ownership stake but removing himself from the daily demands, and the arrangement suited both of them because it was honest about what each person brought and what each person needed. Thomas and Rebecca had their first child, a boy they named William, in March of 1886, and Thomas greeted fatherhood with the full force of his considerable personality, immediately and devotedly overwhelmed by it in a way that made John and Lenora look at each other across Thomas's kitchen table and recognize themselves 8 years earlier. Caldwell itself was changing, as all frontier towns changed in this era, growing more settled, more organized, the raw urgency of its early years giving way to something more permanent. New buildings went up on the streets. A second doctor arrived. The school expanded. The cattle trade shifted and adjusted as the ranges were enclosed by wire, and the long drives transformed from the epic wanderings they had been into something more organized and geographic. And the men who prospered in this changed landscape were the ones who adapted without losing what had made them good in the first place. Blackwell's supply adapted with the same clear intelligence Lenora brought to everything. She had, by 1887, expanded the store's inventory to include materials and goods that served the farming families as much as the ranching families, a deliberate broadening that responded to the changing population of the county, and that positioned the store for the next decade as the county grew and diversified. Alice Tremaine, who had been with her for 7 years now, was fully capable of running the daily operations, and Lenora had graduated to the kind of ownership that is about direction and decision rather than execution, which suited the claims on her time that the children and the household made. She was 33 years old in 1887, and if there had been any doubt about whether the years of a hard life in a hard country would diminish what she was, the evidence was entirely to the contrary. She had become more herself with time, the way well-made things do, more settled in who she was, more certain of what she wanted and what she valued, more capable of the particular generosity that comes from having enough of your own to give from. John watched her across a room sometimes with the still, quiet astonishment of a man who cannot quite believe his own luck. He would be in the middle of something, the accounts at his desk, or talking to one of the ranch hands, or watching Eli work through a problem in the school primer, and he would look up and she would be there, doing whatever she was doing with the full and unhurried attention that she brought to everything, and he would feel something that did not have an adequate word in any language he knew, something that was love and gratitude and recognition all at once. The feeling of a man who knows exactly where he is, and knows it is where he is supposed to be. One evening in June of 1887, they were sitting on the porch after the children were in bed, the summer night wide and warm around them, the stars doing what Kansas stars did, which was occupy the entire sky with magnificent excess, and Lenora said, out of a companionable silence, "Do you ever think about what you wanted when you came to Caldwell?" He thought about it honestly. "Steady work," he said, "honest wages, something to build." "And is this what you meant by something to build?" she said. He looked at her, this woman who had turned down a fortune without a second thought and had chosen him instead, who had given him a son with her eyes and a daughter with her determination, and a life that was more than he had known to ask for. "It is more than I meant," he said, "better than what I would have built if left to only my own designs." She looked at the stars for a moment, and then she looked at him, and her expression was one he had come to know as one of her most private ones, the one she did not show anyone else, the one that was only for him, that contained everything she did not say because she did not need to say it because he already knew. "I thought about what you said to me," she said, "when you first asked me to supper. You said you had steady work and honest wages and a solid cabin, and that you would be honest with me and work beside me and not make me feel like something you acquired." She paused. No one had ever put those words together in exactly that order before. I had had plenty of men tell me what they had. "You told me what you would be." He had not remembered saying it in quite those terms, but he recognized the truth of it. "Did I deliver?" he said. She turned and looked at him full on, and in the starlight her face was serious and warm and entirely, completely certain. "Every day," she said, "every single day." They sat together on that porch for a long time, the way they often did in the evenings, with the night around them and the children sleeping and the ranch quiet under its enormous sky, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was the particular, overwhelming abundance of a life that has been built with both hands and with full intention, that has kept faith with itself, and with the people in it, that has done the daily work of love not with grand gestures, but with the steady, accumulating weight of choosing, every day, to show up and stay. Eli had a dream he talked about that summer, a boy of 7 with his mother's eyes and his father's habit of careful observation, a dream about having a horse of his own, a real horse, one that he could learn to ride properly and care for himself. John listened to him describe this dream with the same full attention he had learned from Lenora, without dismissing it and without condescension, and then he talked to Dale about it. And Dale said that there was a young mare in the south pasture that had foaled the previous spring, a steady animal with good blood, and that if Eli wanted to learn to work with a horse from the beginning, now was the right time and this was the right horse. John brought Eli to the pasture that Saturday morning while Lenora watched from the fence with Clara on her hip, and father and son stood together at the rail and looked at the young mare, who looked back at them with the calm, measuring intelligence of a well-bred horse, and Eli said very seriously, "What is her name?" "She does not have one yet," John said. "She is waiting for the right person to give her one." Eli looked at the mare for a long time. "June," he said finally. "Because she was born in June and because June is a good word." John looked down at his son. "June it is," he said. It was a September morning in 1887, when John Whitaker stood at the fence and watched Eli put June through her paces in the paddock, the boy steady in the saddle with the natural ease of someone who has been taught well, and thought about the morning 9 years ago when he had sat outside me's diner with his cold coffee, and heard a woman he did not yet know decline a fortune with the dignity of someone who knew exactly what she was worth. He had understood it then, in the quick, instinctive way that sometimes delivers truth before your reasoning has caught up. He had known she was worth more than he had. He understood it now the way you understand things after 9 years of evidence, not as a quick recognition, but as a deep and well-founded knowledge, the certainty of a man who has spent almost a decade discovering the precise dimensions of what he had been given and finding, every time, that it was larger than he had measured. She came up beside him at the fence, Clara having been deposited with Thomas's Rebecca for the morning, and she stood close enough that their arms touched, and she watched Eli ride with the expression she wore for good things, the controlled warmth, the private satisfaction, the love that she did not perform for anyone but that was entirely visible in the set of her face when she looked at the things she loved. "He is doing well," she said. "He is doing very well," John said. She leaned slightly against his shoulder, a small and habitual thing, and he put his arm around her without looking away from the paddock where his son was riding, and the morning was clear and the light was good, and the plain stretched enormous and golden in every direction. And the world was, in this moment, exactly what a life built by 2 capable and honest people with their hands and their hearts had made it. "Thank you," he said. She looked up at him, not quite expecting that. "For what?" "For saying no to Garrett Ashford," he said. "For knowing what you were worth. For not settling for what glittered when what was good was still on its way." He looked down at her, and everything that he had ever thought about this woman and about what she had given him was in his face, unhidden, because there was no one else he would have hidden it from less. "For choosing me." She held his gaze for a long moment with those dark, steady eyes that had first startled him behind a store counter 9 years ago and had been startling him every day since. "You made it easy," she said, "by being worth choosing." Eli called out from the paddock, something about the mare's gait that he wanted his father to see, and John called back. And beside him Lenora laughed at something Eli did in the saddle that was very exactly like John when he rode, the same particular angle of the shoulders, and her laughter was warm and open, and she did not try to contain it. There would be more years after this. More seasons on the Kansas plains, more drives and more harvests, and more of the particular dailiness of a shared life. The store would grow, and Thomas and Rebecca would have more children, and Eli would grow into a young man, and Clara would confound and delight everyone around her with the specific combination of her parents' best qualities. Dale Hutchins would eventually leave the ranch to John outright, which would be a complicated and moving thing to receive, and John would run it with the care of a man who understands the weight of what he has been entrusted with. And through all of it, the center of it would hold, as it had always held since the beginning, since a clear October morning in 1878, when a man with $40 and a good horse sat outside a diner in Caldwell, Kansas, and heard a woman speak with the voice of someone who would not be bought. It held because Lenora Blackwell was the kind of woman who knew what she was worth and never bargained it away, and John Whitaker was the kind of man who, when he understood that she was worth more than he had, did not decide she was therefore out of his reach. He decided instead to be better, to be steady, to be honest, to be present, to show up every day with both hands and a whole heart and do the work of deserving her. And she had looked at that, at the plainness and the steadiness and the honest intention of it, and she had chosen it. She had chosen him. On a porch in September in 1887, with the sound of horses and the smell of autumn and the children growing and the plains going wide in every direction under an enormous sky, that choice still stood. And it was still, by every measure either of them knew, the best thing that had ever happened to either of them. The story of John and Lenora Whitaker was not told in grand gestures or dramatic turns, though it had held both. It was told in the daily evidence of two people who had decided that love was not a feeling you waited for, but a thing you built, every day, out of the materials available to you: honesty and patience and attention and showing up again, and going on showing up. It was told in a ledger kept precisely in a general store on the corner of Main and 2nd in Caldwell, Kansas. It was told in a cabin with a good stove and a porch and a cottonwood tree growing beside the door. It was told in the way a boy rode his horse in the morning light with his mother's eyes and his father's shoulders. It was told in the full, open smile that Lenora Blackwell had first given John Whitaker across a counter one October evening, the smile she had always kept only for him, the smile that in 9 years had not become smaller or less. It was, by any measure worth keeping, a good story. It was, by every measure that mattered, a full and happy life.